Hello, everyone. Before I offer our official welcome, just want to provide a quick reminder to please engage in this conversation using the chat function. We welcome your thoughts and your questions. We will have an audience Q&A about 20, 30 minutes into the program. And then also feel free to tweet your thoughts and your opinions and retweet any tweetables that I'm sure our panelists will drop this afternoon using the hashtag Education for Liberation. And please remember to follow these amazing panelists. And you can also follow the Shot Foundation at Shot Found. So welcome to this conversation. I'm Leah Austin with the Shot Foundation for Public Education. The Shot Foundation is a national public fund that serves as a bridge between philanthropy and advocacy to build movements and create collaborations through our national network, the Opportunity to Learn Network, which represents at least 150,000 parents, students, educators, and advocates through about 40 organizations. We are working with a diverse set of partners to drive educational change in educational practices and policies so that we can create more just and equitable schools for all children. I am just thrilled to be your moderator today. I know we're going to have just a really engaging and interesting conversation. So excited about that. So why this conversation and at this point in time? We know that to date, school closures that have been caused by the coronavirus have affected at least over 50 million students in around 124,000 public schools in this country. Our partners, advocates, parents, teachers, students have been calling for this as a moment, not just to, and we know this is important, right? But not just to recover lost learning and to address the trauma that many students, especially students of color, and their families have encountered as a result of the trio of pandemics: public health, economics, and racism. But also that this is an opportunity, it's really a call, it's a must do to fundamentally reimagine education. So I'm joined today by an amazing group of educators, of advocates, parents, who are going to help us to understand what exactly does it mean to reimagine education? How do we create a vision for the educational experiences that we want our children to have? What ideas can they provide for what this vision could or should look like? And then how do we build the demand and the power to actually obtain that vision? So again, good afternoon to all of you who are joining us as audience members, and good afternoon again to our wonderful, lovely, amazing panel. Panelists, I'm going to ask you in just a second to introduce yourselves by sharing your name. And this is where I was a former kindergarten teacher, so the educator in me will, without a doubt, come out throughout this conversation. So I'm going to ask you to introduce yourselves by sharing your name, your organization, and then so that we might really call in some courageous conversation, if you would share the name of an educator who has influenced you or still to this day influences you. And I'll also just ask the audience, in the chat, feel free to throw your name, your organization, and the same, an educator whose experience, whose wisdom still sticks with you as you're trying to do your work today. So Kalila, can I throw it to you to start introductions, please?
Sure, thank you, Leah. I'm Kalila Harris. I'm the Managing Director for K-12 Education Policy at the Center for American Progress, and I'm also a non-resident senior fellow with the Maryland Center on Economic Policy. The educator that always comes to mind is actually my best friend's father. His name is Roy Prescott, and he was a founding teacher in the true tradition of Black educators. He was a founding teacher at my middle school, Philippa Schuyler Middle School for the Gifted and Talented in Brooklyn, New York. And he has passed away. He passed away last year, but he was the only Black male educator I had any interaction with before I got to college. And he was a strong dad, but as a teacher, Nobody wanted to mess with Mr. Prescott. He demanded excellence in all things. There was not even a question of the expectation of us. And I hold his philosophy that we are excellent on site and that anything less is unbecoming of our children.
Thank you. I love excellent on site. Karen, you want to jump in and introduce yourself?
Sure. Hello, everybody. I'm humbled to be on the panel with each one of you, and I'm excited for all the attendees we can't see, but thankful that get to talk a little bit about my work and my vision. My name is Karen Marshall. I'm the executive director at Rethink New Orleans. We are an organization that specifically supports Black young people in becoming radical organizers, and specifically around abolition, education equity, food and land sovereignty. Um, in terms of education, I have to give a shout out on number one to my Caribbean upbringing and say that my family, as a collective, did an incredible job. My Auntie Yvette actually homeschooled most of my cousins and I, up until probably like second grade. My uncle Easton helped me understand, at the time when I understood of like third world economics. My dad and my uncle, one of the first people that gave me the book, I was in middle school, read Eric Williams, From Columbus to Castro, and then Capitalism and Slavery. So I have just a wealth of folks in my family who weren't traditional educators. None of them were actual traditional teachers, but certainly gave me a foundation in kind of Black liberatory education by the things that they asked me to read and the ways in which they demanded that we think critically. I remember just being a kid and I couldn't just say yes or no. I always had to have a reason for something. With my parents and with my aunts and uncles, that entire group of people. And so I learned to think deeply about what I want and why and how to make decisions with a collective of people. So just shout out to those folks who've been incredible in my life.
Awesome. Karen, where in the Caribbean are your folks from?
Jamaica.
Okay. I yeah, my family's from Guyana, so
Oh,
totally understand you just can't say yes or no. There's a whole lot of explaining.
exactly.
My family's Jamaican and Costa Rican, so ditto.
Oh, I see you.
We're
Yeah.
all got it. Definitely, definitely great. Just so glad to have you here. Jesse or Rich, who wants to go next?
Can everybody hear me?
Yes, now we can.
As much time as I spent on Zoom, really, I'm gonna enter in on mute. Okay. Good to see all y'all. I'm coming to you all from Spelman College in Atlanta, Georgia. I'm an associate professor in the education department. Been in Spelman for the past 11 years. The majority of my work here looks at the institutions and I would say the practices around praxis and pedagogy that came out of what we identify as the Black Freedom Movement. So that's my work. And let me see, educators. I'm gonna cheat slightly, so because I'm a grandparent's baby. So I grew up next door to my grandparents, so it was me and my mom. So my mother, my grandmother, my grandfather, without question, are the foundation in terms of, me having an understanding with respect to being able to think critically. Similar to Karen, also Kalila as well, and I'm sure Jesse probably had a similar upbringing where it was never just the answer, it was beyond the answer. And as many sessions that I had in the car driving back and forth to school with my grandparents and my grandfather, those life lessons still, like they're literally a part of who I am, today. So between, I would say, my granddaddy's '98 Oldsmobile and my grandmother's kitchen table is where I learned most of, I would say, the Meridian, Liberty, Macomb, Mississippi ways that were brought north. Second and first Great Migration south to what my girlfriend will say is Chicago City. So that's where my groundings come from. The educator that I, can never separate myself from in terms of kind of like a legacy with respect to looking at all things from an African-centered perspective. And then also he's one of the first ones who influenced me to not separate me being an educator, for wanting to be a historian, for also wanting to be a critical theorist, is Dr. Anderson Thompson. So he passed away a year ago. So Dr. Thompson was one of the founding members of the Chicago University. Also, he was a leading theoretician for what one of my colleagues identifies as the Chicago School of African-Centered Thought, in addition to being a founder of ASCAC, the Association for the Scholarly Research of Classical African Civilizations. But Dr. Thompson, he will always be one that I think about in terms of an educator, because the amount of time that he spent with me when I was going through the proposal and dissertation process. He was not my actual instructor at that particular time, but he made up an ad hoc committee who literally grilled me. So by the time I got to my dissertation defense, it was literally a walk in the park. And that's not, to make light of me going through the process, but those older cats in Chicago, they put me through it before I actually went through the defense. So shout out to Dr. Anderson Thompson, who's an ancestor. So those are my beginnings.
Thank you. And you, Rich, definitely, I had two flashback moments. One, dissertation, that's a beast. Even if it was a walk in the park, it's still a beast.
Yeah.
Two, education by way of the car. So I had a flashback of me and my siblings in station wagon being asked all sorts of questions.
All kind of questions.
Flashback. Thank you for that. Jesse, you want to introduce yourself?
Yes. Well, it's an honor to be with you all here today. And I am a ethnic studies teacher and English language arts teacher at Garfield High School, my alma mater here in Seattle. School of Jimi Hendrix and Bruce Lee, and the site of Martin Luther King's only visit to Seattle, where he gave a speech in the Black neighborhood. And we've been a hub of civil rights activism. And so it's a great place to get to be a radical Black educator. And I also am working with the Zen Education Project, launching our new Teaching the Black Freedom Struggle campaign. I'm an editor with Rethinking Schools magazine, and I'm on the steering committee of Black Lives Matter at School. And we've launched a new initiative called the Year of Purpose that I'm really excited about. And in terms of educators, I had so few Black educators growing up. And it wasn't until I got to college and I had the opportunity to work with Leola Johnson that really transformed me. I realized so much of what I learned, I had to unlearn, and I had to really investigate the truth on a much deeper level. And the kind of framework that she gave me for how to investigate the truth and how to uncover the stories that have been denied from me for so long was really revelatory for me. And I think she really embodied the idea that Septima Clark put forward, who is also, I think, one of my great teachers and inspirations of all time. And, Septima said, I believe unconditionally in the ability of people to respond when they are told the truth. We need to be taught to study rather than to believe, to inquire rather than to affirm. And I think those lessons have helped me on my journey to build radical movements to reimagine what public schools could be.
Thank you. As you were talking, on one hand, I was trying to think about the high school I attended and what super cool alum we have. I'm sure there's some out there, but we didn't have Jimi Hendrix. So that definitely didn't get to have a flashback there, but also just love what you said about investigating the truth and the necessity there. And it really actually leads us into the first question that I want to ask you all. And again, just in terms of flow, we really want this to be a conversation and to really have a discussion and engage with each other. So I, obviously as moderator, have a set of questions that I want to put forth, but I also welcome you all and your expertise and wisdom to ask each other questions, engage in the questions as you see fit, so that we really can have a robust conversation. So in terms of investigating the truth, right, at SHOT, we've really been discussing or thinking about reimagining education and what that means. And on one hand, we believe that it's an opportunity to liberate learning, right? There's this first step that needs to be taken that requires that we examine our education system using a race lens, and that we are then able to assess historic and current policies and practices and really come to some real understanding of the impacts that they've had on the learning outcomes of students of color. So in an effort to do that, in an effort to reimagine or liberate learning, we have to acknowledge that we've been ineffective intentionally at providing Black children a real opportunity to learn. For example, I think about the book, The Education of Blacks in the South, and there's a term in that book that James Anderson uses that's called rebel, or the term is rebel literate. And the notion is it's used to describe the extent to which slaves would go, the extent to which our ancestors would go to learn to read and write, to be educated, because they understood education as liberation, education as freedom. And so it would go to the extent like death to actually learn to read and write. So you could say that as Black people, since we arrived, were brought to this country, we've been constantly imagining and reimagining our education. So as we sit together today, last day of September in 2020, and we're using this language, reimagine education, my question to you all is, what does that mean? What does it mean to reimagine education? What exactly are we thinking or considering when we use that term?
I'm happy to jump in here. When we think about the concept of reimagining, the first step that I would challenge folk on is taking a step back and breaking the chains of what limitations you have for what school and schooling can be. Oftentimes, and since the coronavirus, I've heard a lot of people talking about reimagining education and saying, what if class sizes were smaller? And what if there were an extra adult in the classroom? And what if there were tutoring for students by older students? And all of those things would be great, but none of those is reimagining education. And the ways we think about what school is requires us to call on our ancestors and call on liberatory practice to the extent that the classroom is just one venue, a part of a continuum when it comes to schooling our children. We heard from each other, sitting in vehicles where our seatbelt was the long arm of the driver. Being, as I remember, as I said, I'm Costa Rican and Jamaican. My dad would use that opportunity to speak Spanish to us because my mom was an English speaker. And so he wanted us to be able to communicate with our abuela, to communicate with cousins and that kind of thing. And, he'd have us going through the alphabet and the days of the week. And, I think he understood that we knew house Spanish already. But, all the ways in which we construct what schools are, we need to deconstruct. Reimagining absolutely includes decolonizing curriculum and building structures of anti-Blackness, but that's just a starting point. The question is, should we be using that curriculum to begin with? Should we be in structures where our students are experiencing educators who are hostile to them? What does it mean to have the community be a part of the classroom? There's lots of conversation about community schools. And as with everything that becomes trendy, you have folk doing community schools and it's led by some nonprofit or community partner and not actually And I mean community as in nonprofit industrial complex, not community as in the everyday people who experience the neighborhoods in real life. But it doesn't include the community having control over what the design of the school is. It doesn't include the community expressing what needs they have or how they want the schoolhouse to be a hub for a broader community, whether or not the children are attending that school in the 5, 10, 20 block radius. It also doesn't mean, we just need more charter schools on every corner because my ancestors would not have us leave behind those who were most vulnerable or those who didn't have the wherewithal to take their kid across town to a charter school or to sit on a design board for a new school that they wanted, or to prioritize one group of kids over another. And so that concept of pulling out as opposed to pouring into the community is one we need to really consider. And that's not a rejection of charter schools, but they have a place as one tool in the toolkit of providing quality schools for all children. But the question is, what is the baseline of quality? And what are those ingredients? And what does it look like in the minds of the community? That also includes us pouring into community different perspectives about what schools could look like, right? We talk now and people joke about homeschooling their children, and they're really not. And in some ways, it's a little bit disrespectful to homeschooling families because it's a lot of work to homeschool your children and to devise curriculum that you think is going to be enriching. But we can learn from homeschooling families about concepts like unschooling and having students direct their learning. So, it really starts with us taking a step back and first rethinking what we believe school to be. And, growing up in Brooklyn, New York, school included on the weekends for some people going to Dance Theater of Harlem or going to Fulton Avenue and taking African dance classes in Bed-Stuy, or, whatever the case may be, it included more than just your schoolhouse. And I think we've moved very far away from that.
Leah, can I jump in there?
Absolutely.
So I want to say consistent what it is that Kalila actually just brought up in terms of taking a step back, because thinking about the title, one of the first things I said to myself, okay, if we have to reimagine, what did we initially imagine? So, coming from one of my colleagues, his book, who actually is a student and a mentee of James D. Going from the cotton field, like literally from the cotton field to the schoolhouse, thinking to myself, okay, well, as John Hibbert Clark would always say, okay, if we are actually looking at the past, looking at history, the utility is that we're able to keep memory. And I think in being able to keep memory in that particular instance, I think too many of us aren't necessarily aware of what it is that we actually had done in order to not only position, I would say the national body politic in order to be able to establish public education, but what it looked like coming out of, an enslavement category to now being a freed individual to which you're trying to imagine a world based on a language that's not yours, based on a land and space that's not yours. So I don't think enough folks really know about that period, pre-Reconstruction, about maybe 10 years, right after we were manumitted. So that period of liberation for about 10, 11 years. So the Freedmen's Bureau period, in which you had 13th through the 15th Amendments that were installed, but the work that was put in with respect to Black folks literally taking it upon themselves to construct civilization through this liberatory passport of ed. Black folks always wanted to learn. And in that, I'm always telling my students, I said, do me a favor, look at the one scene on The Color Purple when Nettie goes to school or whatever, and then she comes back and she has the little pieces of paper and she's actually teaching her sister how to read and sound out, particular consonants and words, et cetera, because she couldn't go. By some miracle, the baby sister was able to go and then being able to come back. But the tradition starts prior to, as you mentioned, Leah, in terms of Black folks like literally risking life and limb, through the Black codes, because, one enslaver who was a part of the House of Virginia, I want to say the year is about 1757, he said, we've done everything to close every avenue with respect to their growth, that we could only extinguish the light from entering their minds. So they were very well aware of what it would actually look like in the event that an enslaved African would be able to dream and imagine, and then found themselves for about 11-year period prior to the failures of Reconstruction, being able to build schools all throughout the South. And, you know, in homage to James E. Anderson's book, one of my mentors from grad school, you know, shout out University of Illinois, EPS. But in that book, it states when, you know, when the white folks went South, trying to figure out how they could, you know, subsidize and underwrite the process of the education. They say, you know, no minds are going to be able to think for them. No one is going to be able to be able to chart a course for them. You know, this newly freed, now Negro, but African, who is making their way, will have to make their own minds, will have to write their own course, however crooked or illegible that those particular markings may be. So essentially, these folks had already been in practice of self-determination. And that's the foundation of what it is that we actually have as a part of our general legacy in terms of education that many of us are clueless to. So I think we have to see what was in terms of being able to see the possibilities of what we can take, you know, the next phases of education in the 21st century for Black life. So again, you know, I definitely implore folks to look at James E. Anderson's work, in addition to Vanessa Siddle Walker's piece on their highest potential. And then one of my favorites, who I'll probably talk a little bit more about, but one of my favorites, White Architects of Black Education, William Watkins. So just looking at what we did prior to in order to, you know, be able to establish education, so.
Thanks, Rich. And we definitely will get more into some of the themes that you have already begun to lift up in terms of looking to the expertise, the wisdom that we bring with us through our ancestors. But I know Karen and Jesse wanted to jump in as well. So Karen, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And Kalila and Richard offered some really, really dope stuff. So I don't want to rehash what they said. There's two things that I think for me is important to think about when reimagining education. And one is to just go back to the question of education towards what? And yeah, we say education for liberation, but what is the kind of knowledge that we want to produce? We definitely have to have an entirely different production of knowledge that's not a capitalist production. So to think of like how we understand knowledge that we get from experience, how we understand knowledge that we get from like other spaces. One of the things we ask young people occasionally is like, you know, what's the most important thing you've ever learned up to this point in your life and who taught you? And very rarely, no disrespect to any teachers, do they talk about something that took place in a school setting. When I think of like reimagining education, I think of like what takes place outside of this building, outside of like the structure of a school that's created, particularly in the United States for the purpose of like furthering capitalism. I think of like unearthing the ways that we've known things before. I think of like, you know, when we talk about, obviously, like Black people have always fought for education, and sometimes we think of that in the context of like US Black American history. And so we have to think about the ways of knowing that we had, the ways we understood how to survive, how to thrive, how to do what we needed to do to be absolutely free and liberated people, even previous to being brought to whatever shore of whatever country we were brought to through colonization and through the triangular trade. And I think that is important. When we can decenter whiteness as the goal, we can also decenter whiteness as like the beginning point of like, yeah, even when we were captured, we wanted to be free. We wanted to be educated. Before we were captured, we wanted to be educated. We had an insatiable, you know, thirst for learning that allowed us to build. I love going to like Amy Césaire discourse on colonialism when he talks about like the kind of societies we had prior to colonialism is important. So I want to think of education as a space, obviously, towards our liberation, but that exists outside of the current understanding we have of school, the school building, the school structure, that exists outside of the current understanding that we have of like breaking people up by specific age. What does it look like to be intergenerational? How do we embrace the actual kind of way we want to be in the world, our culture, and like the kind of structure we want to be in the world, where we can produce knowledge for each other that helps further what we need to do, rather than like kind of hoard knowledge like the capitalists. Like the more you know and you can kind of put it on the shelf is actually what makes you like more important, instead of that kind of capitalist understanding of knowledge. And I don't want to take up too much time, so I'm going to pause there.
No,
Well,
that's
thank you all. Yeah, thank you all so much. That's so much rich description and food for thought there. I just want to add a little bit to this. And I think it's so important when we're thinking about reimagining to first so firmly declare why this is an urgent task, especially for Black educators and Black youth. I think, again, Septima Clark is such a light for us to move forward in this work. And she said that the Black child is different from other children because he has the problems that are not the product of a social order of his making, of his forebears, right? And so we have a situation where we did not get to set up the school system, and we did not get to design what its purpose was, and it's being inflicted upon Black children and BIPOC children, right? And so I think we need to go back and look at the fundamental tension that existed at the beginning of the implementation of the public school system in this country. Because on the one hand, there was the impetus from below of working class folks, of Black people that knew there was no liberation without education, and they wanted free mass schooling in order to be fully free. But on the other hand, you had the capitalists, you had the captains of industry who wanted a space to discipline the next generation of young people to be integrated into an unequitable society and to be trained to be good, obedient workers to make them incredibly wealthy, right? And so that's the tension that's actually always existed in the public school system from the beginning to this day. And it's marked with fixation on ranking and sorting kids with grades and with high stakes standardized testing, right? And we should note that standardized testing first entered the public schools in the early 1900s as a direct product of the eugenics movement. So someone like Carl Brigham was a person who created the SAT exam to be a gatekeeper for higher education. He was also the author of a book called The Study in American Intelligence, which concludes in its final page that America is doomed to have a lowering of its intelligence because we have Black people in this country, right? And so his design of a standardized test that was a multiple choice test is the same basic design that we have today, and that many corporate education reformers are pushing as reimagining education. They're pushing as reform and some sort of accountability, and yet it's just the recycling of white supremacist ways of ranking and sorting our youth. So instead of trying to categorize our youth and rank and sort them so that they can be integrated into an inequitable economy, we need a whole new purpose for education. And then once we have that purpose, we can figure out how to organize schooling. And so I think that the purpose of education needs to be to transform society and to solve real problems that we have. If we had a perfect society and we were living in an egalitarian utopia, then we might not need that purpose. But given the fact that we have more Black people behind bars on probation or parole than were enslaved on plantations in 1850, we have a social catastrophe in this country that education has to have something to talk about. Given that 1 in 3 women report having been sexually assaulted in this country. We have a social catastrophe that education has to have something to say about. And we can look at the greatest wealth gaps in US history. We can look at the fact that the climate is threatening the very existence of humanity. And these are the kind of problems that we need to reorganize education to solve. And I'll just end by saying that I think instead of separating the classes out by subjects, such as math and science, social studies, language arts, we should separate classes out by the real issues that are facing our students in this world, right? And so I can imagine a class about police budgets, and the class could be called, Should We Defund the Police? And in that class, you can learn about the current percentages that police budgets make up in your city. And you can learn all kinds of math that way, right? In that class, you can learn to deliver a speech to the city council about your conclusions on the topic. And you can learn all about language arts and giving speeches. You can learn about the history of where the police came from, out of slave patrols in the South and out of breaking picket lines in the North. And you can learn history that way. And instead of artificially breaking apart our subjects, we can integrate them into a way to solve problems. And I think that's really what the legacy of Black radical educators have bequeathed to us.
Thanks, Jesse. And I know Kalila wanted to jump in, and then I do want to move forward on a couple of other questions that get us more specifically talking about like the role of Black educators. But Kalila, why don't you go ahead?
So this may be a good segue, and since we're talking about radical Black educators, I would be remiss not to surface, the due diligence we need to put into not recreating capitalist structures, to Karen's point, and not prioritizing the Eurocentric heteronormative ways of pursuing education and what is identified as being educated. And a part of that is for Black folk to really think through the ways that elite Black people, more affluent Black people have played a role in pursuing capitalism and pursuing acceptance of white communities, and thereby disrupting a more communal and closely related to our ancestral practice in schooling. And so when we think about integration and Brown v. Board, and you had situations across the country, and we know Brown v. Board was a number of cases collapsed into one, but some of those other cases and some of the other instances, for example, in New York City, in New Jersey, and others, where there was no pursuit of integration, there was a pursuit of resources. Families knew enough to say, I don't want my child transported across town into a hostile environment. I don't want my child to lose Ms. Jackson and Mr. Brown, who are PhDs, to be put into a schoolhouse with teachers who have less education than them. But what I do want is the same access to new textbooks, to have, if we fast forward to 2020, to have access to schools that are not filled with lead and asbestos, are not exacerbating or causing asthma, where the windows aren't sealed shut or that there are no windows at all, but instead give us the resources we know what's best for our children. And so I want to make sure, as we talk about reimagining or designing outright, since we know reimagining sometimes involves just taking a little bit of what we have and zhuzhing it, as opposed to totally setting that aside, that within our community, we are talking about the ways in which we decide what is valuable. And time and time again in our history since Reconstruction, we have seen people pursuing the white man's water as colder than our own, and pushing for schooling and pushing for policies and guidelines that allow us access to be included into someone else's, as if ours is not good enough. It's that concept of if you work hard, you can get into Harvard, as opposed to if you work hard, you can get into Spelman. That mentality and that philosophy is something we also have to disrupt if we're really going to create experiences for our children that support them practicing self-determination. Otherwise, we're enslaving ourselves into a different system, right? It's just morphing as opposed to turning into a situation where we decide how to live freely.
Wow. No, the historical ground, and I hesitate to say historicals because that makes it sound as if we've moved past, and that's part of the point that you all are making, right? So that grounding is so essential for us. And I appreciate even the challenges around the language of reimagining and the language of education, and like really taking that time to unpack and understand, or at least try to understand what we mean by those terms, right? And so I just jotted down some themes from what you all said around there's tension and questions of knowledge production, this idea of unschooling and not just what we're learning, but where we're learning. The idea of this like hoarding of knowledge, right? And the sorting and the ranking, and the more you have or the more you get, the better you are, the more valuable you are in this society. And this overarching call for what we really need to be doing is create what is defining our designing for ourselves, like what is the purpose of education? What do we really want that purpose to be? As we use education to try to change what Jesse just really powerfully named a social catastrophe. And so I want to pick up on that, but move us into a bit of a conversation around the role of Black educators. And in many ways, I mean, I think that we're pretty clear and understand that educators can mean many different formal and informal roles. But for a minute, I want to focus or hone us in on educator in the more traditional norm of like K-12 public school educator. What I want to understand, I say it that way because we know that there are about 3.54 million teachers in this country. We know that, the majority are white women. So I wonder, how do we then, and how are you all in your work? Because for many of the reasons why we brought you and wanted you to be on this panel is because there's work that you are doing in real time to really activate and amplify the voices of Black educators. And so wanted to just hear from you, like, how do you all see and support Black educators in being able to do this work of reimagining, of recreating, of starting from scratch? Like, how are you doing that? And just give us some sense of how you're doing it, how you're supporting, and what you're learning. What are you learning from Black educators that we all need to hear more clearly? Jesse, you want to start?
Sure, I'd be happy to. It's been an incredible experience getting to work with Black educators across the country in the Black Lives Matter at School movement. The movement started in Seattle in 2016 with one elementary school where the faculty there decided they were going to build a day to celebrate their Black youth, and they were going to high five the youth on the way in with the Black families out front of the school. And the art teacher designed a shirt that said, "Black Lives Matter, we stand together." And all the teachers were going to wear that shirt. And then it got leaked to Blue Lives Matter and some other far right wing sites, and the school started getting bombarded with hate mail. And then a particularly hateful individual made a bomb threat against an elementary school for the audacity of the teachers to just publicly declare that their Black children's lives had value. And so the school district canceled the event, and they brought in bomb sniffing dogs that morning to see if the threat was credible. And to the credit of the community there, they went through with the event anyway, but it was much smaller than it would have been. And so I approached the faculty there because a good friend of mine, Professor Wayne Al's sons, went there, and he connected me with them, and we brought them into the union and said, how can we support you? And we came up with the idea of, if we really support you, we won't just pass a resolution saying we do. We'll all wear the shirt that says Black Lives Matter to school. And we'll all teach about institutional racism and the long Black freedom struggle. And so, we passed that resolution, but then October 19th, 2016 came around, and we, had to make sure that the teachers were ready to follow through on that commitment. So we partnered with the community, with the Black student unions, and with the Parent Teacher Association, and with the NAACP and the NAACP Youth Coalition. And we got 3,000 out of the 5,000 teachers to wear those shirts. And it was an eruption of solidarity that spread all the way to Philadelphia, and they took it up. And what happened in Philly was they took it to the next level. They expanded it from a day of action to a week of action. And they broke down the 13 principles of the Black Lives Matter Global Network into teaching points for each day of the week. And they really launched this national movement. And ever since then, we've had the first week of February be the Black Lives Matter at School Week of Action. And we have, 4 demands as well, around undoing institutional racism in the schools and empowering Black youth, hiring more Black teachers, and implementing Black studies, getting rid of zero tolerance discipline, and also funding counselors, not cops, and getting the police out of the schools. And this year we've launched a new initiative called the Year of Purpose, because it was never, our week of action was never meant to limit Black education to a single week, right? It was meant to highlight it. But now we have a new framework where we have a series of questions that we think all educators need to ask themselves and reflect upon throughout the year in relationship to their anti-racist pedagogy. And then in addition to those reflection questions, we call on educators to participate in a day of action every month of the year. And the next day of action is October 14th, which is George Floyd's birthday. And we hope that educators across the country will mark that day with their students, talking about who he was, his legacy, and the movement that has exploded in the wake of his death, and talking about what it would mean to reimagine education, to fully fund our schools, especially in Black and Brown communities. And so I'm really grateful for all the leaders that I've got a chance to work with in Philly, in New Jersey, and all across the country who are part of this Black Lives Matter at School network.
Thanks, Jesse. Kalila, I know you have the We Build EDU platform, which is a platform to amplify educator voice. So can you speak a bit about the work that you all are doing?
So in partnership with Educolor and my brother, Jose Vilson out of New York City, CAP and Educolor stood up a microsite, webuildedu.org. And the goal of the site is to lift up voices and amplify voices of educators who are Black, Indigenous, Latinx, other non-Black people of color, to tell their stories about how they experience school closures after COVID, how their instruction and their engagement with schooling changed as racial injustice exploded in terms of people, or I should say intensified the fight for racial justice. And then now as schools have reopened, what their philosophy is on how schools are designed to serve all children. Excuse me. And our philosophy on educators is that capital E, any adult who interacts with young people at the schoolhouse, we are looking for their stories. So that includes bus driver, crossing guard, cafeteria team, custodial team, office manager, of course, guidance counselors, teachers, administrators, one-on-one aid, parent liaison, any adult who is pouring into children day to day to get them to school safely and get them home safely, but also pour into their learning. We are looking for their stories, and people can go to rebuildedu.org to complete a form sharing their story. And if you are not an educator, you can fill out the call to action to ask legislators, both in Congress and your state legislators, to listen to the stories of these educators and really consider them when we think about things like, okay, we need CARES Act money to put up plexiglass and PPE, except that we knew before the COVID pandemic that there was deep disparity that was laid bare as a result of the pandemic school closures, and really thinking about things like schools are not daycare centers, and the idea that schools have to open so families can go back to work is a catastrophe in and of itself. And if we value education, then we need to think about a structure to make sure children are getting that safely and not putting their lives and the lives of educators at risk, but also so that families who have to work and are on the front lines, or simply because they are families who have lower incomes, that they too have a safe place for their children to go. But all of that notwithstanding, we want to make sure that we don't miss this opportunity. I say to people frequently that, 2020, other than being a complete shit show, is here to heal us. And sometimes we are so hard-headed that we are very willful in doing things in the way we want to do them, whether it's eviscerating our climate, to moving incrementally, as people say. Whenever people say education policy, we can get things done incrementally. I'm like, well, whose children would like incremental education? So I think that 2020 and the universe decided, and our ancestors had a little meeting and said, if you will not do it, we will do it. And it's forced us to sit down and deal with the things that we, in many ways, and this is a part of what I said before, I say to people in justice work that the Black middle class is the bane of my existence, because we have been for our lifetime told to pursue capital goods and to get a house in the suburbs for our partner and our children. And that is not the way of our ancestors. For those of us on this call who were raised by people from the Deep South or south of the border, there's no preschool. You go with auntie this or auntie that, or you go with your grandmother or, your great aunt, and they keep the children. As Karen said, you call it homeschooling, but you're going to learn how to cook the food that we have. You're going to learn how to tend to the field. You're going to learn how to sew and things that are so basic, but not basic. I'm going to send you to the store, or you're going to come with me and your little 3-year-old self, you're coming with me to the store to understand how much is a quart, how much is a gallon, how much is an ounce. And we've lost that. And so We Build EDU seeks to get the voices of educators who represent the majority of public school students, right? Public schools has a new majority. I don't believe in the word minority unless it's in context. And so I'm not a minority. I don't know about the rest of you. I'm not a minority on this planet. And certainly when it comes to public schools, children who are Black, Indigenous, and other non-Black people of color are the majority of students in public schools, even though their teachers don't look like them. So we're looking for those stories, spread this far and wide. We're seeking to collect all 50 states and US territories to hear how schooling is happening, but to really dig down and get the voices of those people through a critical race lens, right? And in critical race theory, we don't substitute our voices for other people. People tell their own stories of their lived experience. So that's really the core of this, as opposed to us interpreting what we hear from educators around the country.
Thank you. I so appreciate you, Kalila, and Jesse sharing the work you're doing. It's just, it continues to be so critical and necessary that we don't just, invite, as we know, we talk about those closest to the problem or those most impacted by the solution, or the problem have the solutions. But what we often do is like invite people to a table that's already been set, already kind of know the direction you're going in, and you get to check the box to say you spoke to, a parent, a brown student, a teacher. But what you all are really exemplifying for us is that it's not just about, we heard some stories from some teachers, right? Or we worked with some teachers to put on some t-shirts. It's really about acknowledging the expertise, the experience, the wisdom, the profession. Like educators, and I appreciate capital E, are leaders, right? So it also totally irks me when we do this, like educators and leaders, as if there's some separation. And so just appreciate the work that you all just described for us. And I have to say, I also loved the visual of our ancestors having a meeting. And just, I can see them like, y'all do not listen. So we're gonna have to really show you in a very, very clear way, the way forward. And so totally appreciated that. I wanna bring in Karen and Rich, and want to have you all talk to us a bit about, in the few minutes that we have remaining, about community and school partnerships and the work you all are doing to really bridge what can sometimes, feel like a gap or a divide between the school and the community surrounding the school. And I know, Karen, you in particular have some interesting work that you all are doing at Rethink to support students and educators in your organizing work. And so just wondered if you could talk a bit about that. And then Rich, I know you've done some significant research around communities and school advocacy work. And so just wanted to bring you all into the conversation to help us think about how those collaborations support this work as well.
Yeah, thank you. Well, to start off, to kind of talk about like the way that we work with teachers and around organizing and young people, students, I think it's important to say that we have to have particular expectations and supports for Black teachers. We don't actually control any of the schools. Just to go back to when we were reimagining education, we don't actually control the school or the function of the schools. So the function of the schools under our current conditions, under capitalism, is supposed to do a particular thing, and within that, teachers, whether even Black teachers, are supposed to like have a particular function in those schools. So one of the things that we try to do is to kind of make that all clear and like lay it plain, is that schools, our current schools under capitalism in the West, in the United States, function to make sure that, the working class, we kind of take our place and we learn to be exploited. We learn to be, be disrespected. We learn to be dehumanized, and we learn to take it. And what the role of teachers is Black teachers is supposed to be, I'm not saying that all Black teachers succumb to this, but the role of Black teachers is supposed to be is to help us believe that that's okay. You know what I mean? And make it a little bit easier. That's why, unfortunately, and also against their will, many times is a lot of Black teachers, whether or not it's their official function, get placed in these roles of like disciplinarians and what have you, that's, they're in culturally subtractive environments. So one of the first things we try to do is make it clear and make it plain through a real reading of history and understanding of like capitalism. And also we need Black educators to be radical themselves. If we're thinking of reimagining education as a space where that can be liberatory for the folks being educated, it also has to be a space where all the educators have a liberatory practice. I think that's really, really important to say, because in our current system, then they're constantly going to encounter friction. So teachers also have to see themselves as workers, as real workers, as like part of a labor force that's fighting for something bigger. And that's fighting, that understands their role to support like Black young people being free as well in the space. And eventually we have to completely dismantle the entire school system as it exists. We can't make it our goal to just make it a little bit better and a little bit tolerable. So I say all that to say that our work at Rethink is to support young people to be organizers, but to really support Black teachers who want to be Black radical teachers to be organizers as well, and to be and see themselves not only in solidarity with young people and their families, but to see themselves in solidarity with labor and workers, and see the actual role of the school, what the role the school is supposed to play, and then develop strategies to counteract that, to try to undermine it, to be transformative. Some of it can be covert, but some of it can be overt, depending on where you are. But it could be as little as like, you are now a political educator. You're not, you're an educator, but you do political education. I think Jesse mentioned a lot of that before in terms of what you can potentially teach, how you can use, you could teach math by thinking about how you defund the police, those types of things. And we have to create a space where Black teachers can actually know that they can do that, can know the function they're supposed to play, and then make a conscious decision not to do that in it, not to play that role, and be a part of a formation or a collective that's actually moving in a really powerful way. And the last thing I'll say in terms of thinking about all of this in terms of our conditions, I think right now, you know, we were joking around when we first got on about our, you know, what our kind of mental and emotional state, given, you know, everything that was going on in our country right now. But it is to have, we need our teachers to have a sober analysis of like, this is how things are and this is how we can shift. The schools cannot actually, like, we can't force workers to go back to work in unsafe COVID conditions unless the schools open up. What does that mean in terms of our role in pushing back and creating something different? So we're trying to experiment with creating like a freedom school curriculum, a freedom school that can like create alternative, that can actually like, where folks can actually experience creating the alternative that will eventually be a completely different system. We're trying to experiment with, you know, those types of ways of pursuing education that both radicalizes the teachers, but radicalizes the students as well. And I'm gonna pause there because
I'm so sad because it's 4:30. We needed like 2 hours for this conversation, so we may have to seriously discuss a part two. And honestly, there are a couple of questions that came through in the chat that I feel like one or two we may have responded to, got to in our conversation, but there are a couple that we did not get to. So I want to do two things. One, folks are asking how they can follow up with you all. I know that we have a closing slide that has your social media handles. But I think what we also will try to do, as I said, I'm serious about scheduling a part two. And then I want to get with our team and connect with you all. Maybe we can do some sort of social media, Twitter chat or something shortly after to get to some of the really, really great questions that folks had that we just weren't able to get to in the short amount of time we had. But I want to just thank you all so much for this conversation, for this discussion. You all are amazing. You're doing amazing work. We are sending love and light to you all and to everyone who joined us today in the audience. And with that, just thank you again. And I will close us out. And do we have the slide that has their social media handles so folks can follow them? Can we pull that up?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
It's great to be with you all and looking forward to seeing your work.
Likewise. Thanks, friends.